Hello everyone and welcome to the YouTube channel of BeingACCA. In this video, we are continuing with our chapter-wise revision. This is the revision for your chapter number 7. So chapter 7 is what we are revising over here. The name of your chapter is Project Appraisal Under Risk. So whenever a business is facing risk, how can you appraise the projects? How can you find out, the right NPV after taking into account the risk? So this is what we study over here, project appraisal under risk. So let's get started. Now, first, it is very important that there are two terminologies. Number one being risk, number two being uncertainty. So when we talk about these two words, these are often, understood to be one and the same thing, whereas that's not the truth. Risk and uncertainty, even though they may sound similar, are two separate different terms with different meanings, even though the meaning is a thin, the difference lies in a very thin detail, but still it is important that you understand what exactly is the difference. How do you differentiate between risk and uncertainty? So basically, risk is that sort of a condition where you are aware that there are several outcomes. What you're thinking, whatever you're doing, the result can go to 3-4 possibilities, and you know each of these outcomes. And at the same time, you also know what is the probability of each of these outcomes happening. So let's suppose for the first one, it's 10%. For second one, it's 50%. For third one, it's, let's suppose, 30%. And for the last one, again, it is 10%. So you know the thing that you are doing, the project that you're taking, it has 4 possible outcomes. 4 things can happen because of doing this. And what are the probabilities of, each of those events happening? What is the probability that the first outcome will be there? What is the probability that the third outcome will be there? So you know the probabilities which could be there for all of the possible events. Now, when it comes to uncertainty, uncertainty basically means over here, you have an inability. You are not able to predict any sort of thing. You're not able to predict what can be the outcome, and you cannot even predict what will be the probability of that thing happening. So this is how you differentiate between risk and uncertainty. Both are places where you do not know what is going to happen, but when it comes to risk, you know what are the outcomes, you know what are the probabilities. But when it comes to uncertainty, basically you have the inability to predict what could be the outcomes, and hence what could be their probabilities. So this is how you differentiate between risk and uncertainty. All right, so how do we incorporate for risk and uncertainty in our project appraisal is what we are learning in this chapter over here. So the next concept that we talk about is going to be a sensitivity analysis. Sensitivity analysis, or you can also call it a what if analysis. Now, what do you mean by incorporating for sensitivity? How, basically, in this analysis, what you're doing is you're looking at how sensitive is, your final outcome to a change in any of your variables. So what happens over here is basically that you are going to analyze that if a significant variable. So what could be the significant variables? If I'm taking into consideration a project, revenue is super important, costs are super important, and then, taxes are super important. So all of the things which are of significant importance to you, you try to change them one by one, and then you see what impact is it going to make to your NPV. So basically, how do you calculate the sensitivity? Sensitivity is equal to your NPV divided by the factor which you are considering. So let's suppose if I'm talking about the sales, so I will divide it by the sales. Now, how sensitive are my sales to my NPV? So this is how you calculate the sensitivity of anything. Now, one thing is that if you want to calculate the sensitivity of your NPV to changes in cost of capital, sensitivity to change in cost of capital, then the simple thing that you're going to do is you take out the IRR, and IRR is nothing but the sensitivity of the change in cost of capital. This essentially means that if your, IRR basically is the rate at which your NPV is 0. So basically it tells you till what extent can you tolerate the cost of capital to be at what extent, and then you will ultimately start to make losses. So this is how, if you want to calculate the sensitivity of the cost of capital, then you can simply calculate the IRR. One more thing to remember is that if you want to calculate the sensitivity towards sales volume, then make sure in your denominator you're taking contribution. And if you want to calculate for the sales price, then you take out the revenue in your denominator. This is how you will work it out for these two things. Make sure that you are not confused. Whenever you're talking about sales volume, make sure you're taking contribution, and whenever it's about the sales price, make sure that you're taking the revenue. Now, one more thing is how to interpret. Let's suppose you have calculated the sensitivity of contribution as, let's suppose, 10%. So how do you interpret the sensitivity? Is that the lower the percentage, the more sensitive is your NPV to any change in the variable. So over here, we are talking about sales volume. So if your sales volume changes by only 10%, then your NPV can become 0 and can even fall to negative beyond this value. So this is how, if you have a lower percentage, even a small change is going to change the NPV by a bigger amount. This is how you interpret the sensitivity analysis. Now let's talk about a few advantages that we have in this method. Advantages will be, number one, that it gives you an idea of sensitivity to original estimates. So whatever your estimates originally are, you get an idea that how sensitive are the variables to your overall NPV. All right. Then another advantage that this analysis gives you is that it identifies the critical success factors. Identifies critical success factors. What are CSFs? Critical success factors basically are those areas which are very important for the success of your project. So once, because you will, with sensitivity analysis, you will get to know which variables are going to affect the NPV very strongly. So then you will be making sure that, you know, these are identified as key areas, and then you make sure that you are working towards them, that no changes are there when it comes to this thing. Now let's talk about more advantages. Number 3 over here is that it can be easily adapted in spreadsheets. If at all you have a spreadsheet functionality available with you, then it's very easy to do a sensitivity analysis. And last but not the least, which we talk about, it's going to be that it directs the attention of the management to check the quality of data. So whatever is the data that they are using, basically, if I'm finding sensitivity to be very high, so the management is going to think twice of the numbers, that whatever numbers we have calculated, what is the quality? Are these reliable or are these not? Do we need to reassess any of the numbers? Quality of data. So these are a few advantages of doing a sensitivity analysis. Now, with every thing that you do, which has its advantages, will always have its disadvantages also. So let's have a look at a few limitations. All right. So when you talk about the limitations of sensitivity analysis, number 1 is that your variables are interdependent. Variables are interdependent. Now over here, if you see, we are just seeing the change in NPV which will be there by changing only one variable at a time. But don't you think if one variable is changing, other variables can also change, because they are a little bit interdependent. So let's suppose if your sales units are changing, then your variable costs are also going to change. So because these variables are interdependent, just changing one variable at a time does not make a lot of sense. Now, another limitation which is there in this analysis is that it assumes the data is accurate. Obviously, because it is basing all of the calculations on the data which is providing. So this is a basic assumption that the data which you're using is absolutely accurate. Then another thing is that it is time consuming if you do not have a computer. Time consuming without computer. All right. And another limitation is that the probability of change in variables is not considered. Change in variables is not considered. This is another limitation. And last but not the least is that it does not provide a clear decision rule. Does not provide a clear decision rule. So this is your last limitation as far as sensitivity analysis is concerned. Now let us move to another technique where we are trying to incorporate risk and uncertainty in our project appraisal. So the next method that we are going to talk about is going to be a simulation. Now over here in sensitivity analysis, we were only changing one variable at a time. But when it comes to simulations, we are basically trying to change more than one variable at one time. So basically, this is a technique which is used wherein you're changing more than one variable at the same time. Now over here, there's a Monte Carlo simulation which has been explained, even though, numericals cannot be asked on the same. There are just briefly, steps which have been covered on how you can perform the Monte Carlo simulation. So I'm just quickly going to lay down these steps. And that should be enough. You do not have to practice any numericals as far as the Monte Carlo simulation is concerned. All right. So number one step that you're going to do over here is going to be to specify your major variables, which could be cost, which could be revenue, whatever is most important to you, you specify the major variables. Then the second step is that you specify the relationships. Specify relationship between the variables. So let's suppose the variables that I have taken over here are revenues and costs. So if I just want to specify a relationship, relationship is nothing but profit is equals to revenue minus cost. So this is one relationship which I have established between the two variables which I think are major to me. Then the third step over here is going to be attach probability distributions. So to different outcomes, I'm going to attach different probabilities. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to simulate putting different values for revenue and different values for costs. And then in the last step, in the second last step, I'm going to record the outcome of each simulation. And last but not the least step is going to be to run this many times so that I get a range of probabilities of different outcomes which can happen. So repeat the simulation many times so that you get a distribution of possible outcomes. So this is how you work out your Monte Carlo simulation. These are the stages. Again, repeating, numericals will not be asked from a Monte Carlo simulation. Then let's talk about the advantages. What will be the advantages over here? Number one, that you get more information about possible outcomes and also their probabilities, because through simulation you are also noting down what are the outcomes and you're also noting down what is the probabilities of them happening. So another advantage over here is that your data can be used to calculate your expected NPV. Now what is expected NPV? Where you are basing probabilities into NPV, that is how you calculate an expected NPV. Now let us talk about the limitations also at the same time. Limitations when it comes to simulation. Number one is that it is not a technique for decision making. Rather, it only gives you more information about the outcomes. So not a technique of decision making. All right. Another limitation which simulations face is that it is expensive. Number three is that it is very time consuming. Again, if you do not have a computer. Without a computer. And then last but not the least is that all of the probabilities that you are using, these are basically based on assumptions and estimates. So it's only good until your estimates and whatever you have thought would happen actually happens. Your assumptions, your estimates are accurate. Only then it is good. So another limitation is that only as good as probabilities, assumptions, and estimates. All right, so this is the technique of simulation. Now, another technique which we have in this chapter is the concept of expected values. Now, expected values is nothing but you are weighting the uncertain events according to the probabilities that they have. So, what is the probability of them occurring? You weight it according to that. So, EV is nothing but sigma of x multiplied by px, x multiplied by px. Px over here is the probability and x over here is the outcome. So probability multiplied by the outcome, you add all of the things and then sigma is what you get. So with this you will get the expected value. Now let's talk about a few advantages over here. Advantage number one is that it reduces the information to one value. So let's suppose if there's a lot of information, 10% probability for this, 50% probability for this, 30% probability for this, and then 10% again for this. So you have a whole lot of data which is available to you. So whenever you're calculating the expected value, you're basically reducing all of the information that you have to one value. Whenever you multiply this, all of these things together, and then you add all of them together, this is when you will work out the expected value and you will get only one value as the final answer. So this is an advantage that it reduces your information to only one value. Now let's talk about the second point. It is easily understood. So this is another advantage over here. All right, now let's discuss a few disadvantages. Disadvantages over here being number one, that it is difficult to estimate probabilities. This is number one disadvantage. Number two is that average may not correspond to any of the outcomes. May not correspond to any outcome. So let's suppose there are different outcomes which you have. You calculated the expected value. So expected value is nothing but the average, which is the weighted average. So whatever outcome that you are getting, it may be very different from the weighted average that you were getting. So this is one disadvantage that this method has. Number three is that it is not valid in one-off situations. Probability, always remember, will work the best when the outcomes are getting multiple times repeated. So it is not valid in one-off situations. All right. Now moving towards the last but not the least limitation over here, which is that it ignores the risk. Again, the point over here becomes that there is no indication of spread of possible results. So let's suppose if my value weighted average is 10,000, but my actual outcome is 17,000. So it is nowhere near to what I had predicted. Hence, it is basically ignoring risk. You do not know what could be, how different could be your actual outcome from the weighted average which you have calculated. So this is with this we are done with expected values. Now let us move towards the last topic in this chapter, which is about the methods of risk management. So how can a company manage their risk as far as investment appraisal is concerned? So number one over here will be to set a maximum payback period. So they can have an internal decision that we will only take projects which have a payback period of, let's suppose, 2 years or lesser. If any project has a payback period of higher than that, then we will not accept that project. Why are projects which have a higher payback period more risky? Is because the cash flows that you're getting in the later years, they are more uncertain. That is why whenever there's uncertainty, there's risk. Hence, to minimize, to manage your risk, you should set a maximum payback period. Number two over here is to use a higher rate of discount to NPV. Higher rate of discount for NPV. So with this, you're using a safer rate. Even if your cost of capital has risen, it will give you the NPV at that rate. So it accounts for more risk. Then the third technique is that use conservative forecast. Conservative forecast. Now, what do you mean by conservative forecast? Is, let's suppose if you have estimated your revenues to be 10,000, do not show it as 10,000, probably take it at only 9,000. So this is how conservative means. Do not overestimate your income and do not underestimate your costs. This is what you mean by using conservative forecasts. Second, last thing that we have is that select the projects which have acceptable NPV. And then last but not the least is that you should focus attention on CSFs, the critical success factors, which were identified using sensitivity analysis. So this is how sensitivity analysis. So this is how managers can incorporate for risk in their investment appraisal. These are the methods of managing risk. With this, we are done with this chapter. I hope that with this video, you were able to revise this chapter. In the next video, we are going to start with chapter number 8. Thank you so much for watching.